Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us for today's Wonderware InduSoft Web Studio Tips and Tricks webinar, August of 2017. We are going to have hopefully some fun today, show you some interesting things. Really, just want to kick things off and say thank you for joining us. We really appreciate your interest and joining these webinars. We've been doing them for several years now, every month. If you didn't know, we've got over 150 of these webinars recorded up on the InduSoft website and on YouTube, and we're doing them for you. We really appreciate the feedback that we get. If you didn't know, I noticed that there are several, I can't really tell all the names that have logged in, but many of you look like maybe first-timers, and so I wanted to just say welcome, thank you, and for those repeat offenders, welcome back. If you didn't know, we record these webinars. We put them up on the website. That usually happens in a couple of days. Also, you'll receive a survey, follow-up survey. Let us know how we did today. Let us know how we're doing in general. Let us know if there's any topics that you'd like to see. And again, as I mentioned, there's about 150 of these up on the website already, so we've covered a lot of topics. We haven't covered everything, so if you'd like something covered in a little bit different way, or maybe you can't find something, let us know in that survey. I'd be happy to help you out. Also, if you give us your shirt size, we'll send you a free T-shirt just for joining us, show your appreciation. And also on there is a question if you'd like to co-host a webinar with us. We'd love to have you on. Let us know if you'd like to do that. Let's see, what else? On this webinar, this type of webinar, I can't hear you. There's no audio portion from the audience. So if you have any questions, please put those into the chat panel or the Q&A panel, and I'll try to get to those as soon as I can. I have had one person say that they can hear but they can't see. If somebody could confirm that we've got visual as well, that would be great. In the chat panel. Okay, so it looks like we've got video. Maybe I would suggest signing out and signing back in for that person who can't see the video. So what was I saying? The last thing I was saying, is if you have a question or a comment, put those into the chat panel or the Q&A panel. There is a Q&A section at the end, but if you get a question in while I'm presenting and I can see it, I'll try to answer that during the presentation. Real quick, for those of you who haven't been on one of these webinars before or don't recognize my voice, my name is Scott Courtier. I'm Senior Technical Sales with InduSoft. If you've watched any of the training videos, it's my voice on there. About half of these webinars I do. And today I'm going to give you a brief introduction on InduSoft for those of you who haven't joined us before. And then I'm going to cover 4 or 5 different topics here. We're going to talk about graphics and symbols. We're going to create some scales for symbols, typically for like meters and things of that nature. I guess they don't have to be for symbols, but that's where I uncovered kind of this technique of creating the scales, and I wanted to share that with you. Custom widgets, that's a relatively new feature in InduSoft Web Studio, only the last couple of versions. And we haven't really touched on that very much in a training video or in a webinar. We've got a tutorial video out there that shows you how to use a custom widget to create a web browser. But today I'm actually going to use it to create a gauge on the product. So hopefully show you how to do that a little bit better. And then I'm going to talk about database troubleshooting. I recently spent some time in a project doing some database connectivity, and I'm not a database person. So I've, working with some of our internal team, saw how they were able to troubleshoot database connections and some of the techniques that they used, and thought, wow, that might be kind of neat to let everybody know about. So if you, the custom widgets and the database troubleshooting are a little bit more advanced than the other 2 topics. So let's go ahead and get started. For those of you who don't know, InduSoft is very easy to use, yet still very powerful and flexible HMI and SCADA software, very affordable. You can use it on any really PC, industrial panel PC, embedded device, mobile device, and it's really very low-end SCADA, kind of mid-range SCADA, high-end, low-end HMI, mid-range HMI, low-end SCADA, mid-range SCADA. It's very, very capable, from 150 tags to 10 million tags. You can do from a very, very low-end kind of embedded device to an HMI to a plant monitoring to a global monitoring system. I've worked with a lot of customers who have used this product to monitor many global facilities all over the world. So, we have run times that will run on Windows CE, Windows Embedded, Windows Desktop, such as Windows 7, 8, and 10, as well as Server Edition of Windows. And we even have runtime versions for Linux and VxWorks as well. One of the neat things about that, we talk about the portability here. This top horizontal slice, if you will, shows that we can run on all these different operating systems. And if you've ever seen a presentation from InduSoft, you'll know that the concept is be able to develop once and deploy across any of these operating systems. How neat is that? Develop your project once and deploy it on Windows CE or Windows Embedded or Windows 10 or Linux, and not have to redevelop that for all those different runtime platforms. That's kind of neat. The mobility slice here represents our 3 different types of thin clients: Web Thin Client, which is Internet Explorer based, Secure Viewer, and on the right side here, shown on the tablets, iPad, Android phones, smartphones, tablets, etc., is our SMA Thin Client. That stands for Studio Mobile Access, and that's you can see a little icon over here with this number 5. That means that it's HTML5. What's really neat is you don't have to download an app for those devices. You don't have to maintain it. Your customers don't have to maintain it. We don't have to maintain it. It's just using a standard browser, whether it's the later versions of Internet Explorer or Chrome or Safari, on any of the operating system platforms that are pretty popular these days: Windows, Android, Apple, Linux, etc. And why am I talking about this? Because I'm going to try to show you some of the features and how they expand out into the SMA clients and just how easy that is. We've got this interoperability slice here, the ability to talk to PLCs, robots. I'm going to demonstrate some database connectivity, cloud-based drivers, things of that nature, all representing the ability to make you more productive with a more reliable system, and of course with security in mind. So that's all I wanted to get into with the product part of it. So let's get into some of the symbols and graphics. Now, there's several different ways to get images into symbols or even on the screen with InduSoft Web Studio. And I want to talk a bit about why am I even talking about this today. We've had some feedback based on the symbols that we've created. And if you haven't seen this, in addition to the symbols that are in the product, if you go to the InduSoft website, here under the store free add-ons, if you scroll down, there's most of this page, with a few exceptions, are symbols. And we've been putting them up here for a couple of years, typically on a weekly basis. There's things like some gauges, I/O faceplates, status list. Here's a set point indicator, some stoplight indicators, clocks. Some of these have made their way into the actual product, so you may have seen these. And so for the later versions of these symbols, as I scroll down, and they've been put up here in chronological order, these may not have made it into the product yet. You know, I'm going to use this green meter here and demo later on. But what I wanted to point out as I scroll down here, hopefully I'm not making you dizzy, there's a section of indicators or buttons, I should say. I think they're coming up here soon. I didn't realize they were so far down. Yeah, here they are. These buttons. What happened is when I released these buttons and we put these on the website and people installed them, it turns out that the images did not come along with them. And you know, now that I think about it, I'm not even entirely sure that those images are fixed yet. I think I've seen a recent question about, hey, they're not coming in. So we'll take a look at that soon. But these are the types of things that we do. We actually listen to customers' responses, and here I'm going to not only bring up how to fix these or show you how to do this yourself if you're creating your own. So this is what prompted this going forward. So what I'm going to do, is I've got a couple of these images in a folder, and I'm going to put them into an InduSoft project. So before I started today, I just saved some time. I created a blank application. I put this title up here, and I made it a screen called main, and I made it my startup screen. Other than that, I've done nothing else in this project. There's, if I was a magician, I'd be showing you my sleeves and saying, hey, look, there's nothing up my sleeves. I haven't done anything special to this yet. So what I want to do is I want to talk about graphics in general and how they interact in InduSoft Web Studio, but also in symbols as well, and some special things that you need to take care of. What I'm going to do is open up here in my, let's see, my Windows folder for today's Tips and Tricks webinar. I made a folder with icons. I've got home. You can see down here it's a little home icon. Maintenance is a little hammer and wrench, and trend in case I need it. I don't think I'll need that. I'm going to start with the home icon. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to right-click on that and open this up with Microsoft Paint. Now, it doesn't have to be Paint. It can be really any third-party graphic tool. Just everybody has access to this. I'm going to select all, which is going to give me a selection around that entire thing. I'm going to copy it to the clipboard, and then I'm going to go back into my InduSoft application here. I know it's a little large, but I'm going to paste this in here. And what you're going to see, if I double-click on it, it's actually converted that paste into a bitmap, first of all. It's converted it into a linked picture object, which can be found up here on the ribbon interface in your graphics tab. And then the other thing that it's done is it's taken a checksum of that entire picture, and I'll show you where that comes from in a second, but basically it's renamed the file when you pasted it in here with a checksum of every single bit that's in this graphic. And that way we can tell if you paste another graphic in that's exactly the same. In fact, let me do that. It's still in my clipboard. If I hit paste here, and maybe I hit paste again, and maybe these are pumps or valves or wind turbines or something that you put on the screen. Maybe in this case I have 3 copies. Maybe it's 100 copies of that. What we started doing a couple of years ago or so is if you look here in the project viewer, we actually have this checkbox, and now it defaults to save pictures in separate files. And what that's doing is when you paste a picture on here, you can see it's named it with this big checksum. And if we take a look, the file name here, I'm not going to remember all of this, but it ends in BD34. And if I go to the next picture, it ends in BD34. And if I go to even the one that I scaled, it ends in BD34. And the reason why that's important is if you have 100 copies of these, it doesn't have to have 100 different files it just makes it a lot lighter weight, more efficient. And where has this put this? This has put this in the web resources folder of my project. So just to show you where that lives, if I go back to where my Tips and Tricks Afternoon, this is the one I'm working on, it's put it in the web resources folder. There's that BD34, it's that home icon. It put it in there so it can keep track of it. And the reason why I put it in the web folder is if you're publishing these pages to HTML5 enabled devices, iPads, Android devices, etc., when you publish those, it can get to the web subfolder, whereas it might not be able to get to the root folder of your project or higher. And therefore, if your graphics aren't showing up on an HTML application, you might want to try putting them into the web subfolder, or even more particular in the web resources folder, and then repointing your project to that particular link. So that sometimes helps. If I take this object, and let's say that I here under graphics, and I wanted to make a button out of this, or maybe a rectangle with a command animation. I'm not going to get into making that for today's webinar, but I'm just going to show you the concept here. So first of all, if you didn't know this, I imported this picture or pasted this picture, and I want this white rectangle to be transparent. I can double click on that and set a transparent color. If I knew the actual color, the decimal representation of the red, green, blue, I could put that in here. Or I can use these little tracker, these little handles here. There's one extra one down here in the corner, and I can move that over the color that I want to be transparent. In this case, I'm just going to leave it on white, and so I'll make that white transparent, and I get that nice, I get that rectangle going away, so that looks a little bit better. If I then make this a symbol, and I window around all the objects, create a linked symbol. Now, I'm not going to teach you here how to make a linked symbol. We've got many other training videos, as well as several webinars. I think there's 3 or 4 webinars up on the website that show you how to make linked symbols. That's not the focus of that. I just want to show you the focus of today's webinar. I want to show you a little bit about pictures. So I'm going to create that linked symbol, and it's going to put that in my project in the symbol folder, and I'll just call this home. And so where that's put that is not in my global system symbols, but it's put it inside my project here. I probably should have made a separate folder in there to make it easier to navigate. But this symbol is typically something you can take this symbol from this project and copy it and paste it into another project very easily, and then keep your common look and feel. So that's one easy thing that you can do. Now I took that picture and I opened it up in Paint, and I copied it and pasted it. Another thing that you can do is use the linked picture icon here on the ribbon and point to, let me go navigate to that picture that's in my on my hard drive somewhere, and it's way over here, not even in my project, and I'll use the maintenance icon. And again, I know that's a little bit larger probably than we want for this type of thing, but reduce it down. Probably makes sense to make it the right size for the application rather than a little bit larger, save a little bit of space. Pretend to make another button here. And so this one I've actually copied, not copied, but pointed to using this linked picture object and pointed it to this location here on my hard drive. This can present a problem. If this icon is way over here in another folder somewhere and you download your project, it's only going to download really the folder that comprises your project. In this case, it's my tips and tricks afternoon, and all of this stuff is going to go down, but that image is really residing elsewhere on the hard drive, and it's probably not going to be able to find it. Let's see, when I make a symbol, and I don't know when we actually implemented this, but I'm using the current version that's up on the website, which is version 8.0, Service Pack 2, Patch 1. When I make this a symbol, it knows to keep that picture local. So let's call this maintenance. And so now you can see here my project symbols, both of those are there. And if I was to take those 2 files, just go out to my hard drive, let's say, and in my symbol folder, if I was to take those 2 files, well, I probably would not get those pictures, or I might not get those pictures because they kind of reside elsewhere. But if I take these pictures and I right-click and I say Send to System Symbols, and I make a new folder here, we'll call this Tips Afternoon, and I put that symbol in there. I want to save that. Oh, you know what? I didn't save that before, but let's try this. Maintenance, send to system symbol. We'll put that into the tips afternoon. There's my home symbol, and I'll save that. If I was to go now into the system symbols, which is where InduSoft is installed, so under Program Files x86, wonder where InduSoft Web Studio version 8, symbol folder. If I look in here, this is my global folder. If I look in the tips afternoon, not only did it put my symbol files in there, and this is why on the website I kind of messed things up, or on accident I should say. Here's what happened. I really just posted, or we posted these symbol files, but didn't include the pictures. So when I went through that process, it actually put those pictures in the symbol folder so it knew where to find them as opposed to spread out all over my hard drive. So if you're moving these from one application to another, make sure that you actually copy those pictures along with, and you can see how I did that, and hopefully that helps you understand maybe why you lost your pictures in some of your applications, whether they're in symbols or just as linked pictures in general. Okay, enough of that. Let's get rid of one of these. Let's move a couple of these over. And bear with me a second. I'm going to grab a quick drink of water. I'm going to lose my voice here if I don't. All right, I'm back. Sorry about that. The next thing that I want to cover, let's see, make sure I covered everything here. So we did a copy and a paste from Microsoft Paint. We did it as a linked picture. I showed you where the resources folder was, so I think I covered everything in that. Now I want to talk about some little tips and tricks that I've learned on making scales for symbols. This doesn't have to be for symbols. This could be for meters or whatever. But what I'm talking about is the scale that you'll see here, the little tick marks that I typically make with lines when I make some of these symbols. So let's go back into the development environment, and what I'm going to do is pull that meter in, and that's here under meters, and it's that green energy meter that I want to see in there. And if you notice, there's no little tick marks on this in the development environment. They're actually all stacked up here at the top. And when I run this, they actually rotate out. They kind of fan out. And I'll show you how I did that. So if we run this right now, you can see that those little tick marks are there. And how did we get there? Well, if I edit this symbol, actually before I do that, let me go create some lines here. And I'll show you what often is the problem. And somebody said on this morning's webinar, wow, I'm glad I'm not the only one that has that problem. So I want to make, let's say, 10 or 11 of these lines. So I'll select this. I'll hold down my control key. And, oh, look, I grabbed the handle, which I didn't mean to do. I'll hold down my control key again. And I'll make a copy. And I am having trouble grabbing that, so I'll make another copy. Maybe I'll grab all three of these and make a copy. So what I end up with is all the different tick marks that I need for that, just made out of lines. And then I'll configure these to have a rotation animation. It'll rotate around that center point and be either a negative number of degrees or a positive number of degrees, depending on what I need. So let me actually take that concept and edit this linked symbol and show you what I mean. These tick marks here, this scale, are actually tucked way up here in the top, and I can let's see, I can window around these without grabbing any other object. I think like this, and hopefully I can grab this and move that. Now there's 10 or 11 of those things in there. Now the tip that I wanted to show you here today, especially since this takes a little bit of configuration, honestly what I often do is if I make a new meter, I'll go grab this set of these lines and I'll just paste them into the new meter and use those because they're already pre-configured. But the first time you do this, it takes a little bit of understanding in how you do this. And a lot of times you have to open this up, you have to spread these back out, separate these, reconfigure them. And I wanted to show you a little tip that I do here. Since there's 10 or 11 of these things, I've moved the top one off just to spread it away from the rest of the pack, if you will. And then what I do is I window around all of those. Now there's one object here and probably 10 more there. And then once I have just those selected, I go to the Format, Align, Distribute Evenly. Now distribute evenly is going to take the leftmost and the rightmost object and then distribute the rest of the objects in between there evenly. So when I click on that, it takes that whole set of objects and spreads those apart. And then I can do the configuration on these. And let me show you another tip here. If I double click on this, and notice that sometimes it's hard to do, you can see here that one happens to rotate. When this tag is 1, in this case it's not a tag, it's a constant, so it's always rotating the maximum amount. In this case I have it negative 81 degrees, so it's going to be right up in here somewhere. And then if I go to the next one, if I click on that, you can see that this one is negative 108 degrees, so it's just a little bit down here. I'm not sure exactly which one that is, and then so on and so forth. And sometimes you can see, like, I'm having trouble clicking. I'm missing that object. One of the things that you can do, if you didn't know this, you can right-click on an object and get to the properties. That's one way. But also notice that Alt and Enter works. So if I wanted to pick one of these and I was having trouble clicking on it and maybe I wasn't using a zoomed-in view, I can actually window around one and only one of those and select it. And then rather than trying to click on it or double-click with my mouse, I can hit Alt and Enter on my keyboard, and it'll bring up the properties for that one object in particular. So hopefully that's a little tip that helps you. So once I've gone through and configured all of these for the proper rotation, now I'm also rotating around this center point. So this is why this is offset by 135 pixels down there. So that's that center point. And if I remember right, this green circle, you can see has a overall height and width of 270, so half of that would be 135, so that's why that's around that center point there. Then once I've configured these, how I put those all back right up in that perfect spot up there is first I will select all of those lines. I will then align those. If they're not already aligned to the top, I'll align them to the top, and then align them all to the center. So now they're all stacked on top of each other. And I have that whole group of those selected. I can hold down my Shift key, and now I'll select this green circle here because I want to align those right back up at the top of that, not of this beveled gray border, but I want them to be inside of that green circle. So I've held down my Shift key, which lets me select multiple objects, and now I've selected that green circle in addition to all of those line segments. Now this is the last object that I selected. Notice here it's got the darker handles around it. That means it's the reference point. So now if I do an align center, that group of line segments are now underneath this needle. And now if I do an align top, they've actually popped up right here again. So that's, sometimes if you're going back and forth and configuring a lot, those are some tips to spread those back out and kind of recompress those and then put them back in the right spot. Those are some techniques that I used. Or if you don't want to do that and you're creating your own symbols, sometimes it helps maybe to just take these and paste them into your own symbol and use what I've created, and hopefully that helps you out. So I'm not going to save this. And so that was one of the tips that I wanted to talk about. So. All right, moving on, custom widgets. All right, this is going to be a big one. This is a feature that we added into the product a couple versions ago, and we haven't really emphasized yet, and I want to start talking a bit about this. There's actually a video up on the website that we did. If you go under Support on the website, Video Library, Example Videos, you'll see here that there is a custom widgets tutorial. It's only about 18 minutes long, and it shows you how to make a web browser out of a custom widget. Well, first let's go back and talk about what is a custom widget. So if you're familiar with or not familiar with what an ActiveX or .NET object is, it's a third-party created object using Microsoft standards, in this case either ActiveX or .NET, that you could bring into your project. So somebody else could create an object, compile it as either ActiveX or .NET, and the InduSoft screens are then a container for those objects. Well, we recognize that especially as we're starting to deploy these projects and view them on HTML5 devices on Apple and Android and Linux devices, that those Windows technologies, ActiveX and .NET, are Microsoft Windows technologies. They don't work on those other devices. So we wanted to come up with a way that we could interface with third-party JavaScript and HTML created objects that are just all over the internet. The problem is that there's no real standard interface. So this custom widget tool that we've created basically allows you to create your own interface to third-party JavaScript and HTML code that you can put into your project. And with a little bit of knowledge of JavaScript programming, you can then create these neat widgets that you can just find on the internet and put them into your project. Now, again, these are typically third-party things that we don't necessarily support or create. We don't own these, if you will. But what I'm going to do here is let's go to a website. So there's a lot of these things. You can find all kinds of different things. I'm going to use one that's fairly simple and easy to understand. We found this on the web, and it's called JustGage, GAGE.com. You can download it here, and this is really neat because this is everything that we need to create that custom widget, and I'll show you how this works. Now, earlier today, I downloaded the code, which is the JavaScript code for creating these gauges, and there's all kinds of neat versions of these things. You can see here we can make them larger, smaller. You can create different ways that they refresh. You can change colors. You can even customize shadowing and things of that nature. So there's lots of different really neat examples, and most of those examples come along with the download. But basically, I need to put these two JavaScript files in my project, and I'll show you how to do that in a minute. Then in an HTML file, I need to create this div tag. Now, this is kind of like the container of where this code is going to live. And then I put this script in my HTML, which essentially calls this JavaScript and then draws that gauge on the screen. But I need to be able to create my interface. The first part of this is how do I create the interface from InduSoft tags to those JavaScript properties. So in InduSoft, they're called tags, and the value, let's say in the min and max in JavaScript, are called properties. So how do I tie the tags to the properties? Well, I'm going to build that custom widget and show you how that's done. So if I come down here, give myself some space, and create a custom widget. And now there's no custom widgets, and we actually are kind of planning ahead and going to have libraries of these that you'll be able to import. So there's an import tool here. But I want to show you how to create your own if you've got some JavaScript programming skills. Trust me, if you don't know JavaScript, you're probably not going to be able to do this. And there's other ways that we can do this. You can either hire a consulting services group or find somebody that knows how to do this. But if you don't know JavaScript, you're probably not going to be successful in this. I don't know JavaScript, and I've struggled with this for a while, but I think I'm starting to figure it out. But trust me, if you don't know JavaScript, this is probably not for you. So I'm going to create a new gauge here. We're going to call it Gauge 1. And I'm going to make it 300 by 300 in size. And I just need to pass it one value for this demonstration. I'm just going to pass it the value of the meter, if you will, or the gauge needle. And I'm going to call that val1 and put that in here. And for those of you who are familiar with ActiveX and .NET, you essentially get properties, methods, and events. And properties, methods, and events are ways to get data into the object, out of the object, and then tell if something happened to that object, like somebody clicked on it, or there was a mouse over, or it ended downloading, or whatever event you would get that back. So we can define here properties and events, and there's other ways to define methods as well. But for this demonstration, I'm only defining one property that I'm going to pass to that object. I'm not getting anything back from it. So here I have gauge 1, the height and width, and one property called val1. And when I highlight that, and this will appear up here, so it's got that gauge 1, that's 300 by 300. Notice that this has got the HTML5 logo and this text gauge 1. I'll show you where that came in a minute. In order to pass that a value, I'm just going to use a slider symbol. If any of you have seen my training classes, you know that I tend to favor slider 1. It goes from 0 to 100%. In this case, I'm going to create a new tag called temperature. And that doesn't exist. We're just going to leave it as integer. So now this symbol, this slider, is going to go from 0 to 100. And this tag is temperature. I'm going to go into that custom widget that I just created and open up this members button here. You can see that property that I created, that val1, I'm going to tie it. This is kind of that glue that makes this work, is I'm going to tie this to that tag temperature. So now the InduSoft tag temperature is going to write to the property value, and now we got to go set up the JavaScript to be able to receive that and do something with it. So this is kind of how we've set up that standardized interface to be able to use in InduSoft Web Studio. And now we got to go talk about the JavaScript and how to make this work in our project. So here in my project, let's see, let me go to today's project, which is Tips and Tricks Afternoon. In the web subfolder, the reason it's done it in the web subfolder so it can publish these as HTML if you need it, it's created a new folder in here called widgets, and it's made gauge1 as my widget. And in here is really two files that we need to pay attention to. Index.html, and if I open this up with I use Notepad++ as my text editor. It kind of helps me with languages a little bit. It highlights things a little bit easier. You can see in here, this is the body of my HTML. And look at this. There's that HTML5.png. That's that HTML5 logo that we saw. And then the text, gauge1. And if I go back to my object, that's this stuff right here that it's displaying. And what I'm going to do is it's using the resources, APIs, proxy.js to know when you've made the change, and then it knows to work with this custom widget.js. And if I go back in here, that's this custom widget.js, and this is the index.html. So basically, this is giving me a little window into the JavaScript contained on my screen. Now, what I did this morning is I actually downloaded from that Just Gauge website. And before I forget, I want to go to their GitHub page and show you that this is licensed under the MIT license. It's licensed, here's the copyright to those guys. And this can be used free of charge on commercial or personal applications. So just to point out that this is their license, it's not our product at all. But what I did this morning is I actually went to their website and I downloaded this. And let's see, where did I put that? Here under downloads, Just Gauge, and I unzipped that. And so here's those two files that are referenced on their website, Just Gauge and Raphael 2.14 min.js. And I'm not sure if I need this third file. I could probably read through their documentation to make sure, but I'm just going to copy it just in case. It's only 7K. It's pretty lightweight. If I really wanted to pay attention to size, I would try to figure out what that does and if I need it. So I'm just going to copy these. I'm going to hit Control-C. I'm going to go back into my project. Today's webinar, web widgets, and in that gauge, I'm going to paste those JavaScript files, okay? And if I was going to use multiple of these, I might paste it into a resources folder and then be able to point to that and not have multiple copies of this if I had multiple objects that use those same JavaScript files. Now, in this JavaScript and HTML, the first thing I'm going to do is edit the HTML. So if I go back to my page here, my PowerPoint, there's some changes that I need to make in my HTML, and here's what those changes are. And basically, I'm including those two JavaScript files that I just copied, but under the references that are already there. And so if I go into my Notepad++, you can see those two references that are already there. I need to put those new files in here, reference those new files. Well, I actually did this morning. So I'm just going to copy these scripts here. So I'm going to copy this, go back to this file, and paste those two in there. Now, order is important here. So in this case, these two files have to be after the JavaScript and the proxy. And then the only other thing that I need to do in here is I need to change the body of this. I'm going to delete this entire section here. And So just to point out what I just did, I included these two references to those two JavaScript files. And now in my HTML file, I'm going to basically paste this and this exactly as it is, just to make sure that I've got formatting and everything right. I did this morning, so I'm going to copy from this. The div tag, and I don't really know HTML all that well, but I think what this div sets up is essentially the container for this. So this is a reference for this. It gives it an ID of gauge, and here's the ID of gauge. So this is going to put its stuff inside that div tag. So once I have this, so everywhere from script and then the div, basically everything between the body, I'm going to copy this, go back in here and paste it into the body tag of my HTML. So now that set up the references to those JavaScript files. It set up the div tag for the container, and now this is JavaScript that's going to reference that just gauge JavaScript via this variable called G right here. I'm going to reference that here in a little bit, and I'll show you when we go do the custom widget. So let me save this to make sure I've got that. And now what we're going to do is we're going to go edit the custom widget JavaScript file that when we created that custom widget, it placed a placeholder in here for that. And if I go and edit that with Notepad, what it's done is put this text in there. And really the only, for this demonstration, the two things that we're going to pay attention to is this onload function with this property and callback. And this is why I like Notepad++, because it knows when I highlighted this property name that it found it down here as well. And if I highlight, for example, this callback, it finds it over here. Well, what we're going to do is we're going to take that val1 property that we put in our project, just as a reminder where that is. I put it, when I created that object, it's my property, and that's going to receive the tag temperature. And we're going to replace the property name here with that val1. And when I change that val1 in my InduSoft project with that tag called temperature, it's going to call this function called callback, which is down here. So now I need to put some code in here to be able to receive that value and do something with it. So basically what I'm going to do is give myself some space in here, and I'm going to put a function in here. And again, I did this morning. And this is an if statement. It's very simple right here, and I'll describe this in a second. I'm going to copy that and then paste this into my current project. Now what this is doing is it's taking that, in this case I changed the name here a little bit, val1. Whenever you change the tag on the screen, it updates this property which calls this callback function. The callback function gets called and it says, hey, let's evaluate this val1 and then use it. So it takes the value of that val1, in that case it's my temperature tag, and when it receives it here in JavaScript, this was a problem that I ran into at first, it receives it as a string. Even though it comes in from a temperature tag, which is an integer, it comes into the JavaScript as a string. So this command here then parses it into an integer and then puts that whole value into the variable g.refresh. Now the refresh is what causes the gauge to refresh the value. But see this g here? If I go back to my index.html, that's that variable g there, and it refreshes the value. In this case, it's going to default to 67, but as I change my temperature tag, it's going to update this function and paint that on the screen. I only have one more thing that I need to do if I'm going to update it on the website, but let's see. I'm going to make sure that I save this, and I think that's all that I need to do. Val1 and val1, everything's good there. I'm going to minimize this, and now when I run my project, if I've done everything right here, let me save this screen, run my project. There's my default of 67, and it comes back down to 0 to match this. And now when I change that, I know I think it's painting or updating that whole thing, so it's selected that. I could probably get rid of that if I wanted to, but kind of not the idea for this webinar. But to show you here, I've got this gauge. Now, InduSoft doesn't have this type of object. We would have to make a kind of complicated symbol to be able to do this in there. And what's really neat is this will show up on the SMA client if I want to. So I'm going to stop this. I'm going to publish my screen as HTML. And one more thing that I need to do, actually two more things, I need to go into my mobile access tab here. Now I've already set up Microsoft IIS to be able to publish my pages. I'll go in there and make one configuration change, but I do need to open up my mobile access configuration and just to save it one time to get the mobile access task to be able to start on running of my project. So what I'll do now is I'll run this. My project is running. I'll open up Google Chrome. And I'll put in my local loopback. If I could type here 127 all the way over to my screen called main here. And while this is thinking, what I'm going to do is go back into my project here and open up the help and show you one little more thing that we need to do to get this to work completely. If I navigate into screens, objects, libraries, you'll see custom widget. And here is configuring the web server for custom widgets. Basically, I need to, in Microsoft IIS, which is my publisher, I then need to be able to tell it to find my custom widgets. And I put in my project path in there, and I tell it to use the type custom widget. So I'm going to do that here in a second. But what I wanted to point out here is once this has loaded up, let me get my runtime back in here and click on OK. There's my custom widget, and I think if I update this, yeah, I changed this. Oh, it is working. Not sure why it ends up working. I do know that you do need to create that alias. It might have been something that I did this morning that makes it work. And let me get this out of the way here so you can see. Here's my new gauge there. One thing that you would need to do, and I'm not quite sure why this worked, is go into Microsoft IIS like I just showed you in the help and create a virtual directory. And what I'm going to do is remove the one that I set up for this morning, which is here under IWS 8.0 custom widget. I'm going to remove that one just to show you how to do this technique here. Basically, I come in here and I add a virtual directory, and I have to tell it custom widget. And then I have to give it the path to my project. Well, this navigation window, I don't care for this navigation. It's a little hard to work with. So what I typically do is I'll go back into my project, and up here at the top, which is also here under project, I think it's under information. Another way to do that is right-click here, go to settings, and you can actually get your project path here. I don't need the actual project.app file. I only need the path without that last slash. So I'm going to copy that. I'm going to go back into my IIS configuration and paste it in here. And I'm going to test my settings. And it says I don't have all my authorization, my security set up. What I do need to do instead of doing pass-through authentication is set up my domain login. And for me, it looks like this. My password, and hopefully this will authenticate, and then I can test, and I've got good authorization there. And that is the last step that usually needs to be done. And that's usually, if I don't have that, it prevents it from updating. It'll show, but it prevents it from updating. But maybe because I had that other configuration in there from this morning is why it was working. So really neat thing is, since this is Chrome, this could be on an Android device, it could be on Safari, on an Apple device, and just so you can see how my image didn't show up there. That was the one that I pasted in there. So I kind of didn't learn from my own technique there, but. All right, go back to here. So I did that, and I added these things. And again, I'm going to post this project up on the website when we put the video up there as well. And here's that virtual directory in IIS. So hopefully you thought of some good ideas of some things that you can do with the custom widgets. We've got some good things coming with that. And again, it really takes somebody who knows JavaScript to be able to implement that. So. just a heads up for that. Now I'm going to lead you into some, for the next 10 minutes, database troubleshooting. Excuse me. I recently worked on a project that, questions, let's see, there was a question that came in. Anyone else notice that just gauge download don't match the copy from the site? I matched the names and it worked. Not sure what you're referencing. Let me see if you can give me some more details. I'll bring that up. But good point. I think I see what you're talking about. These names didn't exactly match what was installed when I copied it here, and that's all you have to do is match that. In this case, it's Raphael 2.14, 2.1.4, and not that one, just gauge, not this. But if you, let's see, where was that? That was in my HTML file. Do I still have my Notepad++ open? That was in here. So that's one of the reasons why I copied them from this morning, because I found that. So thank you for pointing that out. That's a really good find. That actually tripped me up for a while. So good thing to point out. Yeah, those actually need to match what you actually have in your folders. So good point. Great catch. Thank you. Appreciate that. Where was I at? Database troubleshooting. So what's the reason for this is many of you haven't gotten very advanced in databases, and I know from some of our surveys people were asking for more help in troubleshooting and using databases. And I'm going to show you 4 ways that I've recently worked on a project. And I'm not a database programmer, so if I encounter database issues and you can help me out, let me know. But I'm going to try to do some troubleshooting ideas that I watched some of our internal people that helped me out, some techniques that they use. The first thing is going to be the output window. We're going to talk about the Studio Database Gateway log, trace messages, and then queries in the SQL Management Studio. So the first thing is the output window. Let me go in here and I'm going to clear this. I'm going to delete what came in here. And I'm going to go back into my main screen and let me add, let's see, we'll add, first I need to create a database and get some data in there. So let's start with that. Let me create a database for today's webinar, and let's see, where's this opening up here? Sometimes this opens up off screen. I can't quite get to it, but here we go. It's opening up on the right screen, correct screen today. And this is not a database class, so hopefully you know how to connect to databases. I'm going to connect up to the database engine here with Microsoft SQL Server Express. I'm going to create a new database just for today. We'll call it Tips and Tricks Afternoon. And then I'll expand this and go down to Tips and Tricks Afternoon. I'll open that up and look at tables, and it's just the system files and the system tables and the file tables. Really nothing new there. And then I'll go into my tasks, and I'll create a trend that will log to the database. And before I do that, I need to create a connection to the database. So let's go here under Options, Default Database, and I've got to close everything before I do that. My apologies, and stop everything. I know better than that. Now here under Options, Default Database, and I'll set up that connection string to SQL Server and go local. That points to that database engine using built-in security. Now let me point it to the actual database, and that was Tips and Tricks Afternoon. Test my connection. Security is good. So I've got that default connection established. And now that I have that default connection established, now I can insert my trend log. And we'll say go to database. We'll use that default that I just set up. It'll automatically create a table based off of this trend's name. Maybe I don't want to do that. Maybe I want to call this production. So So it'll create that table and put in there the tag temperature. And now when I save this and I run this, it will. So right here I'm at 32. I'll let that log a couple of points. I'll put it up to 71 and then back down to 7. I should be able to now go back into my database, refresh my tables, see that it created that production table, and then edit the top 1,000 rows. And here you should see that it started out at 32, went to 71, and then back down to 7. It's actually still logging in the background if I refreshed this. So now that I have some data in there, if I had something wrong, what I could do, here's the tip. Here in the settings, what I could do is click on database messages, insert date and time, and if I had database errors, syntax errors going on, it would actually show up in here. It doesn't put all the messages in there. It puts only the error messages in there, so that's something to notice. Let me take another object here. Let's see. Put it on the screen. And we'll add the grid object to be able to pull those values. I'm just going to pull that temperature out of there. So I'm going to use this. If you want more information on the grid object, I just held a webinar specifically on the grid object. Really good to follow that. So here I'm going to configure this for that same database connection. And instead of using this table, I'm going to use the production table. And I'm going to set up the columns. I want to just pull in that temperature. So we'll call this degrees C. And that temperature field, and that is a numeric value. We'll say OK. And when we run this, I've done everything correct. It's just that easy. That this shows there's my 32, my 71, and my 7. And it's still logging that. So the other tip that I wanted to show you, in addition to the output window here, which I'll come back to that in a second, is the way that many of you may not realize this, but the way that InduSoft Web Studio communicates to a database is it doesn't communicate directly to the database. We use something called Studio Database Gateway that we created. So that's this little icon here. And if I right-click on this, I can unhide it. And so what ends up happening is, let me paint a picture here, is that anything that you're doing SQL-wise that communicates with that database communicates via TCP/IP to the Studio Database Gateway, and then the Studio Database Gateway then communicates to the actual SQL database. And by doing this, we can actually get embedded operating systems to communicate to databases where you normally couldn't do that. But in this Studio Database Gateway, what I can do is I can enable this log and tell it to watch all my messages. And then when I come in here and run my project, and what I should have done is made that thing always on top. But you can see here that object has done select temperature from the production, and it's put that up here. And if I put a refresh on there, you can see it repost that command, or whenever I refresh this screen, it'll do that. The other thing that I wanted to point out is if I do my own SQL in here, so let's put a button on the screen. I'm going to go just a couple more minutes long. Apologize for that. I'm going to put a button on here, and we're going to do a db executes command. I'm going to build my own SQL in here to try to pull a value out of that database. So I'm going to create this tag called SQL, not a tag, sorry, it's a VB script variable called SQL. And I'm going to build that SQL statement out of string here. And for those of you who are not familiar with W3 Schools, I like to use them for reference because I don't really know SQL. I'm going to do this command here, which is a select. I'm just going to select the top row from that column and from that production table. So if I keep that, I'm going to move this off screen so I can reference it. And yeah, I didn't build that thing out. So I'm going to do select. And if place that in a place where I can't see it. So let's try this. Yep, I know that. And sorry, I'm fighting with all these different windows here. Let me put this in a better place here. Okay. So now I can see it. Apologize, you can't. I'm going to do select top. And again, this is not about SQL programming, but a little bit more about the troubleshooting. I'm going to select the top one result from the column temperature and from the table production. And that'll be my SQL command. And then what I'm going to do is a db execute. Now, if I go into the help, I'm going to use the built-in scripting language, database functions. If I scroll down here, is db execute. And this db execute command, I have to give it a named connection to my database, which I'll create here in a second. Then I pass it the SQL that I just created, and then the return set, if it's a select, it'll come back into some InduSoft tags. And so I'll create that here. But first I have to create that named connection. So I'm going to create a connection to that database. It's different than that default. I'm going to create basically a connection to that same database, but calling it MyDB. And I can call that anything I want. But again, I'm going to create that same connection here, just so I can reference it with a name. Oops. Sorry, I actually accidentally hit a key there while I was typing. SQL Express and Windows Security, and go to the database tips and tricks. Afternoon. That's my connection. We're good there. So now I can use that MyDB name in this db execute command here. And so what I'll do is I'll use db execute, and the named connection has to be inside of quotes, otherwise it would be a variable, MyDB, and then the SQL from this VB script variable up here that I've created, or I could manually type it right in there, but I'm going to do SQL. And then the tag that's going to return back into, I'm going to create one called value. It's not created yet. That has to be a string tag, and oh, by the way, it's got to be inside of double quotes. If you look in the help, LUE, and how many result sets do I think I'm going to get back, or rows? I'm going to get back one, and I think that's all I need to do. And if this works, everything will be great. Let's see if it works here. I will put then just a place rectangle to be able to display that value inside of curly brackets. And that needs to be a string tag. Say OK. And if this all works, let's try this. Run. And db execute. Yep. So that first value is a 32, and I got that back. Now, if it didn't work, one of the troubleshooting techniques that I've learned recently is to use trace messages. Now, trace messages actually come out in this output window. Let me show you how to use those and enable those what I think is very effectively. So here, when I've built this SQL command, it's actually built in a VB script variable, and I don't really have a great way to display that. I could put a message box and show that on the screen, but that's not a great way to do that. If I use this trace command, I can then use that VB script variable, SQL, and get that to show up in my output window. But I first have to enable that. So I right-click down here, Settings, Enable Trace Messages here, and say OK. And then let's see. Now when I run this, and I do a db execute, what it's done in the output window is it's sent that SQL trace message here with the time and date stamp. And now what I can do is I can actually take this SQL command and copy it and go back into my database engine here. And many of you might not know this, but actually what happened when I queried this database is it put the query up here and it ran that. I can create my own query, for example, and I could just paste that. There's that select from temperature. Now I got to be careful because this will execute against the database that's named here. So I need to make sure that I pick my correct database here, Tips and Tricks Afternoon. And if I execute that, you can see that it's going to return that result set. And maybe I pick, let's say I'll pick the top 10 and execute that again, and it'll return those top 10. So I can use this. This was new to me. I didn't really know this. This will use this query here and be able to show you the results. So you can test your logic, especially if you're on your screen and you've got you're concatenating values to build up this SQL command, and maybe you've got variables in here and time and date stamps. Well, you can use this technique to put the SQL command out, copy that, go back into your database and paste it and use this. Suggestion that I had from an attendee on this morning's webinar is sometimes they'll build their queries in the SQL management tool here and then go back into InduSoft and then build it from what they know works and returns the proper result set. I think that is everything that I wanted to talk to you about. So the output window, I showed you how to enable that. The Studio Database Gateway, which might have been something new for many of you, which is in here, and unhide that, and you can see those actual messages coming in there that are happening. So there goes that temperature from production. Trace messages is a really good way, especially I was working with some very large SQL commands in the project this past week, and then actually building the query in the SQL Management Studio and being able to work with this, because you can get some really complicated SQL commands, and hopefully that helped you out. So with that, want to make sure that we open it up for questions. If you've been on here, maybe you heard that I can't hear you. So if you've got questions, put those into the chat panel or the Q&A panel. If you've got thanks or praise, like somebody just put in, thank you for that. Great information, they said, especially regarding the databases. Yeah, those are neat tools that I thought would be very handy for those of you who are working with databases and just troubleshooting, and especially if you're not real skilled at SQL, this really helps. So if you have any questions, put those into the chat panel, the Q&A panel now. Otherwise, I'm going to leave a little slide up here on how you can get a hold of us. Info@InduSoft is always great for sales, commercial information, product information. If you need support @InduSoft.com. You can call us. You can often go to our website, and on the home page, let's see, where did I leave the web browser here? It's right here. You can go to the InduSoft page, and up in this upper corner up here, you can chat with us if you wanted to, do an online chat. Training, there's online training videos as well as support video library. The webinars that we have up here are up here in chronological order, as well as over here on the right-hand side based on category. And hopefully this was some good information for you. And with that, it's a little bit after 5. I'm going to go ahead and end the webinar. Really appreciate having everybody on. Hopefully this was great information. Give us your feedback in the survey that you received. Put your T-shirt size in there, and you'll get a free T-shirt just for joining us. And look for us on the next webinar in just a few weeks. Thanks, and everybody have a great day, great evening, wherever you're at in the world. And see you again soon. Thanks.